Red Bull. I tried like Red Bull vodkas and it was I almost threw up. It's like I can't stand Red Bull.
Oh no.
Yeah, go for more like the 5 hour power stuff. That stuff's not bad.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of those. I like the fizz.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I always just go straight for the coffee, the baseline. I'm a giant mug of coffee that I drink like every
Yeah.
day.
I do coffee in the morning, but in the afternoon I have to have something cold.
Yeah. Do you do iced coffee? Because I usually do that when I have my like in the summer.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm not a big fan of iced coffee, so that's why I do the energy drinks in the afternoon.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, it looks like we're live. People are in the chat are saying sounds are good, so that's fantastic. So to jump right in, Jacob, thanks for being willing to come on and have a conversation with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on my channel. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name is Jacob Brunton. I am the co-founder at For the New Christian Intellectual. We are sort of a worldview ministry dedicated to advancing reason, individualism, and capitalism from a Christian worldview. Those things are things that are usually thought of as being at odds with Christianity, and so we're kind of working to fix that perception. And so a big part of what we do is advocating for the idea that Christianity is rational rather than something to believed in like a fairy tale. A lot of Christians sort of treat it like a fairy tale. And my saying is, if Christianity's wrong, then I want to be proven wrong about it. I don't want to believe a fairy tale because I don't think there's anything virtuous about believing a fairy tale.
Yeah, it makes sense. But yeah, I can see why there's some hesitation to think that capitalism fits in with Christianity when Jesus was like a hippie socialist Jew, give everything to the poor people.
Only if you think of Jesus through the atheistic lens,
Maybe
right?
I definitely do, so I can't argue with that. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there is no reason to believe in a God. I don't think there's any evidence or arguments that indicate the existence of a God. Could you tell me what reasons you believe there are that Christianity is rational? And I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. So there are a number of good arguments, I think, that all support each other, but my sort of go-to is a cosmological argument, a version of the cosmological argument. Um, I I don't want to claim that this is like special or unique to me. I formulated it this way, but I'm sure that there are plenty of others who have done so in the past. So I'm not trying to claim anything unique to myself here. I just noticed that some of the ways that it's been formulated by other popular apologists leaves some ambiguity, and so I kind of did my own. And so my version of the cosmological argument is starting with the idea that there are only two types of action. There's intentional action or non-intentional action. And then uh, the premise that non-intentional action requires prior action. So to act non-intentionally just means to be caused to act by some prior action, whatever it might have been. And obviously, I think everyone agrees that there was non-intentional action that wasn't caused by humans, right? So we're kind of ruling out humans as the source of the non-intentional action here. And then there cannot be an infinite regress of non-intentional actions because there can't be an infinite regress of a causal series. There can be an infinite regress of sort of theoretical numbers, like the number line, but there can't be an infinite regress of actual causal events that are interconnected. And that's why it's a series. It's not just a cluster or something like that. So there had to be a beginning to action in the universe, the non-intentional action. And that beginning couldn't have been non-intentional because then it would beg the question. So the beginning of action in the universe had to be an intentional action. And an intentional action presupposes a mind and a will and values. And so we have an intentional actor who began all action in the universe.
Okay, I think I understand your argument. So there's a few things that come to mind first. The first is that you say that their intentional actions do not require preconditions or actions that came before it. So you're saying there's a third kind of action there. It's not determined or random, it's something else. in addition to those two, and that's the intentional action?
I'm not sure what you mean by determined or random. So by intentional, I just mean the types of actions that we think of as human beings, where uh, I intend to do something and then I do it on purpose.
Yeah.
Versus,
So the way I understand it is anything we do, any decision we make is like I decide to drink coffee or whatever. That decision is either determined by reasons, like the reasons in my head, like my desires or whatever, or it's determined by no reasons, which means it's random by definition. If it has no determination at all, it's by definition random. So as far as I know, that's like a true dichotomy, either P or not P. It's either determined by prior causes or not determined by any prior causes. And so if it's determined by prior causes, it's determined. And if it's not determined by prior causes, it's random. And so if intentional states are not determined by prior causes, just like any other physical interaction or causation, then they're either random or some third kind of a thing that we don't know of yet.
so I'm still looking for clarity on the way that you're using the terms. When you said random just a minute ago, it sounded like you were saying that it lacks any sort of causal story. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so either something is determined like a domino, one domino hitting the other, or if there's no like prior domino and the domino just falls on its own, then it would be random. It would be essentially an event that had no prior cause, which by definition would be random. That's just what the definition of random means. It's
So in that sense, I don't think that truly random events actually occur, uh, because that would just mean that it would be a causeless action. So what you're referring to as random, I think, or the colloquial use of random, I think definitely exists, and that's where there's no discernible intention behind the cause, right? So it's random in the sense that the earthquake caused the bowling pins to fall over rather than the bowler throwing the ball and causing the bowling pins to fall over. So the earthquake would be non-intentional on my framework, and the bowling ball being thrown by the bowler would be intentional. And those are the only two types of action that I think are conceivable. I think the idea of a truly random, causeless action that is neither intentional nor non-intentional just doesn't really seem plausible or conceivable.
okay. Let me see if I can explain it this way. I see no difference between an intentional cause and a non-intentional cause. Like a non-intentional cause, like a rock falling or whatever. There's two possibilities. Either one, it was determined by prior physical forces, or two, it's like a quantum mechanics where there's this fundamental randomness to it, and it just happens due to indeterminate forces in the laws of physics. And so every non-intentional cause is either going to be determined or random. And intentional causes seem to be the exact same. They follow the exact same rules as any physical cause. And either the intentionality was determined by prior motivations and desires or whatever, which determined it to be that thing, that whatever you chose to do, or it had no prior conditions at all, and it was just completely random, just like quantum mechanical things, essentially. So it doesn't seem like there's any fundamental difference between intentional causes and non-intentional causes. They can all do the exact same things and have the exact same limitations.
Uh, in that sense, there isn't a difference, but the difference is relevant when we're talking about the nature of the cause, right? So whether it was caused by originating with a will or an intention, a desire. So in this case, we're talking about a person, or if it didn't involve the will, intentions, and desires of a person. And that's relevant just because that's the topic of what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not the pre-human action in the universe was caused by a person. And so in that sense, the distinction between intentional and non-intentional is relevant. But it sounds like what you're wanting to say is that there's a third alternative, which would basically defeat my argument from the get-go.
Oh,
And that
not
is that.
exactly. I wouldn't say that.
Oh, okay.
But keep
Okay.
going. Keep going. I don't want to interrupt you.
It sounds like maybe your intention isn't to defeat my argument from the get-go, but it probably would if you were to say, well, no, there's this third alternative of just random action that's neither intentional nor non-intentional, and it doesn't have to have a cause. Because the whole point of the cosmological argument, as I presented it at least, is to say there has to be a cause to each action, and it has to be either intentional or non-intentional.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not trying to present a third option there. I mean, I accept that there is fundamentally random things just because that's what the physics says, and I go with the physics on that one. But that was not my specific argument there. I'm going towards the idea that there's no fundamental difference between intentional things and non-intentional things in the fact that whatever caused the universe, it could be intentional, but it could also be non-intentional. And there's no special reason to think it's intentional because anything the intentional cause could do can also be done by non-intentional causes. And anything that non-intentional causes can't do, neither can intentional causes. That's the problem, is that it seems like you're supposing that intentional states have this new property that they can do something that non-intentional states can't do. And I don't see any reason to believe that.
I see. So I think we probably are going to need to get into the distinction that you're bringing up then, because in a roundabout way, your third alternative does defeat my argument if it stands. And I don't want to get too detailed. I assume then that you would hold that free will or rational, intentional goings on in our minds are a result of the sort of quantum randomness that you're talking about? Or would you say that it's an illusion and that free will doesn't really exist?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd go with free will is incoherent. I think there can't ever be free will. I think that any action we decide to do, pick up a cup or whatever, is either going to be determined by prior things in our brain, our neurological state, or it's going to be not determined by anything and it's just going to be quantum randomness. And those are the only two logical options. There's absolutely no way to get a free will behind there. It's always going to be determined by prior causes or not determined by prior causes, in which case it's random. And so I think free will is completely logically incoherent.
Interesting. So I would agree with you that on materialism, on naturalistic materialism, that is the case. That those are your only two options, and that would be another argument for not necessarily for theism, although I think you can get there, but for an aspect of the Christian worldview that we are body soul integrations rather than just physical material beings, and that is because I think free will is sort of axiomatic. I don't think it makes sense to conceptualize the idea that we don't have free will. Now, I disagree with libertarian free will. I think libertarian free will is nonsensical.
Okay, could you talk a little bit about that? Could you tell me the difference between what you mean by free will and what libertarian free will?
Sure. Libertarian free will is the idea that at any given moment, I could choose to do X or not X, all else being equal, and that's the part that's really important. So including my mental states, my beliefs, my desires, my goals, etc. All of that being equal at X point in time, or at Y point in time, I could choose to do X or not X. That I think is incoherent because it opens itself up to the randomness objection that you were referring to earlier. That, well, then it's not really you. What are you? That it's just this void that just happens to do something, and it's totally random. And so I don't think that free will or agency is meaningful on that view, on the libertarian view. So I hold to what libertarians would call a compatibilist view. I don't like that term, and what they mean is it's compatible with determinism. But all I mean by determinism, broadly speaking, is what's often referred to as the principle of sufficient reason. And that's also undergirding my argument here. And that the idea is that any event or state of affairs has to have a sufficient causal explanation for its being such as it is.
Okay, so yeah, I totally agree that I don't think libertarian free will is possible, and I definitely take the compatibilist approach. But I've never heard the PSR used in a compatibilist model. I don't know how that applies. Because in most compatibilist models, they're like materialists like me and like Daniel Dennett, who holds that the neurological states in the brain gives us a certain amount of freedom even though they are determined by biology, that amount of freedom we can call compatibilism, which is kind of like the approach I use. But how does the principle of sufficient reason gets you into your kind of free will? I don't see the connection there.
So the principle of sufficient reason rules out the libertarian variety of free will. And then the question is, well, what is free will then? And I wrote a paper on this. I recently posted it on academia.edu, so I'll try to share it with you afterward, and it might help to elaborate a little bit more. But the way I approach the whole debate is different from the way that most people approach it, because the way that it's usually approached is free will compatible with determinism or not? And I want to say, hold on. When we try to evaluate what something is, the nature of something, we don't start with whether or not it's compatible with something entirely different, right? So I want to first find out what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for this concept of free will in itself. And then if it happens to be compatible with something else called determinism, so be it. And if it doesn't, then so be it. But we shouldn't start off by defining it as necessarily compatible or incompatible with this other thing called determinism. So I don't approach it that way. I approach it just from what do we mean by free will? And the reason that most people come up with the concept of free will is a couple reasons. One, it seems sort of self-evident that we can induce and introspectively see ourselves functioning in a free will capacity. And so in that sense, it sort of seems self-evident. So it seems like we've got genuine causal powers as agents. And then another is sort of an axiomatic argument that would say that if we don't have genuine causal powers, then it doesn't seem to make sense that I would even be able to make any sort of rational statement or even form rational thoughts about the world, because the thoughts in my head, there's no reason to think that what's going on inside of my mind is any different than what's going inside of my stomach.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, I
So
totally agree with that. But I don't see how is your conception of us being able to create or have genuine, like, creative intent different from libertarian free will, because they seem like the same thing to me.
yeah, sorry, I'm getting there. I'm sorry. I drew it out a little bit. So those are the motivations for positing that we have free will, and that's just that we have genuine causal agency, um, and leading to general moral responsibility, which is usually the other thing that a lot of people want free will for. And then the question is, all right, well, what's necessary in order for that to obtain? And I would agree with the incompatibilist that genuine free will isn't possible if we have materialistic causal reduction. And so I lean on Jaegwon Kim. I don't know if you're familiar with his work in this area, but he's not focusing on free will. He's talking just about genuine mental phenomena, mental causation, mental powers. And he argues that if physicalism or naturalistic materialism is the case, then there's no causal room left for genuine mental causal powers. And I agree with that. But that doesn't mean that you can't have genuine mental causal powers on a view that is quote unquote dualistic, that allows for the non-physical or the spiritual. And so I would say that free will is free. Our will is free from physical or material causation to a certain degree, but it is not free from our reason states. And
Okay,
in
yeah.
reason states, I would include things like beliefs and desires and goals and things like that.
So yeah, I got you. So you're saying it's not determined by physical things, but it is determined by spiritual things. But so that's why it's not libertarian. That makes sense. That's a coherent view. So why would mental states being determined by non-physical things be any different than mental states being determined by physical things? How does that give you a new feature? Because you said that if it's purely materialistic, then we don't have that true creative power. So how so? Because for me, it seems like it doesn't matter if the mind is made of matter or if it's made of supernatural particles or whatever. It seems like they're going to get the exact same features no matter what. I don't see a difference of why you think that it being made of a different thing would somehow give it a new property.
Yeah, and I get into this in my paper. I think it comes down to what do we mean by the agent or by me or by you, right? When we say it, it's genuinely true that you did this, not that it was caused by some external thing and you're just a puppet, or it's just an illusion. What do we mean by you? And I don't think that we can mean anything other than what your the sum total of your reason states amounts to when we're talking about you as a causal agent. I mean, that's just, it makes the most sense to me when I think about myself as a causal agent. What do I mean when I think to myself, I did this? Well, what I mean is me as the sum total of my beliefs and values and desires and convictions and judgments, and and there's all kinds of stuff that can go into it, but it's sort of a sum total of all of those things come together to form the me that I'm referring to when I'm referring to myself as a causal agent. Now, I believe that I'm more than those things in other respects, but qua causal agent, I think that the agent is causally reducible to those reason states.
Right. So I would agree with that. I could say that when referring to me as a person, it would definitely be reducible to my beliefs and ideas and personality and all those things. But I don't see any difference between saying those things are physical fundamentally and those things are mental fundamentally. Like either way, you get the same result. Like it doesn't matter if a dice is made of glass or wood, it's still a dice. It's still going to roll exactly the same. It's still going to function exactly the same. But it doesn't seem to me that if we make the brain and consciousness non-physical, that it adds any new features. It's just you're just changing the material from glass to wood essentially, but all the same limitations seem to apply. I don't see how the supernatural gives you a new feature or has something new that the material doesn't have.
Well, to say that the sum total of the chemical reactions in my body resulted in me doing X seems pretty different than the sum total of my judgments, convictions, and beliefs about X resulted in me doing X. Right? The second, I I think you would agree, hopefully, carries a little bit more moral power to it.
Maybe so, but I see, like, if we say that the sum total of my beliefs are caused by my brain chemistry versus the sum total of my beliefs are caused by my supernatural chemistry, it seems like the exact same thing.
Um, no, well, first of all, I don't think that it's possible for the sum total of your reason states to be a product of your biology. And here I have to defer to Jaegwon Kim's writings, just because I don't recall all of the intricate details right now. But there are some really good arguments, and so maybe we can come back to that, maybe even a different discussion, and
Oh,
have
right.
a
So
whole
I'm
other
not,
argument.
yeah, I'm not arguing that just, I'm not just presupposing your argument away. So I'm saying that
Sure.
if we grant the possibility that minds can be supernatural, and we grant the possibility that minds can be natural just for the sake of argument, it doesn't seem like there's any difference between these two things other than you're calling them a new kind of thing. Like if I made it a brain out of a computer, like chemical, instead of a biochemical carbon-based life, it's silicon-based computer life. They're still going to have the exact same limitations. They're still going to have the exact same functions. You're not going to add any new functions by making it silicon-based rather than carbon-based. And it seems like the supernatural is a new kind of material in a sense. And you're saying that brains are actually that kind of material instead of this kind of material. But I don't see any reason to think that this new kind of material, like we know nothing about it. We know nothing about the supernatural and how it works. You seem to presuppose that this has new properties that materialism doesn't have, and you suppose that it can solve problems that materialism can't solve. But I see no evidence for that. I see nothing other than it's kind of just an assertion. Like there's this new property called supernatural, and it can do things that material can't do for reasons that I'm just kind of asserting. Like there's no evidence of it, but I'm going to assert it because it feels good. Kind of. That's kind of what it seems like to me. You've just asserted this new property and said it can do new things, but I don't see any reason to believe that. Why would we believe it's has any more or less limitations than physical properties?
Well, I'm not saying or claiming that the supernatural properties or the reason states have any fewer limitations. I'm just saying that they mesh much more closely with what we mean by agency than physical or chemical reactions, right? The the idea of convictions and values and beliefs and things like that coming together to mutually causally determine you to do X, I think just is what we mean by free will. It's you doing what you want to do, regardless of why you wanted to do it, right? So I think if you think that there's no difference between that and between the sort of materialistic story, then I would say that you're probably your standard for difference is probably based on the assumption of libertarianism, libertarian free will, where it only really is significantly different if it's not determined in any way whatsoever. And in
Right,
that
right. I
case,
see what you're saying. But so here's my contention is that if you haven't shown, because I agree that in the way we use language, just using a direct ontology of saying the thing that we're referring to exists as a thing unto itself meshes onto our language much better. Like Theseus's ship, for example. If we say Theseus's ship is a thing in and of itself, that meshes a lot better than saying Theseus's ship is a comprised part of a bunch of millions of electrons going around protons and neutrons that build up wood and things and all that kind of stuff. It's much more elegant just to say Theseus's ship is a thing in and of itself. But saying that it's just a thing in and of itself and saying it's a composite of material doesn't do anything to Theseus' ship. It's still the same thing no matter what, either way you say it. So from my perspective, you're assuming, or you're saying that there's this new thing called the supernatural, which meshes onto our language, our use of the terms intentionality better. And then you're saying that this new thing has a new property. It can create the universe without a prior material cause, essentially, whereas material things can't. And so you've said there's this new property called supernatural, and it has this other new property that we don't have any evidence for, that it can do things that material things can't do, but we don't seem to have any evidence of that, as far as I can tell.
So it's not so much that I'm claiming that there's this new thing called supernatural powers, and it can do these other things. I'm saying that uh, there is a distinction between intentional action and non-intentional action in the very nature of it. And so, and a lot of this is based on the premise that intentional or mental or spiritual states can't be causally reducible to physical ones. And so, in that sense, it's disanalogous to your analogy with Theseus's ship, right? Where you're just breaking it down into the component parts, and really it's sort of a nominalistic, the ship is just a name for all the component parts. Here, I'm assuming a premise that that's not the case with mental phenomenon. That there are genuinely unique powers to our mental capacities that aren't causally reducible to the physical causal goings on in our bodies and in our chemistry.
Right, I grant that. So I'm not trying to argue that this new category is just renaming physicalism and it's still reducible to physicalism. I grant that you're saying that this is a wholly other kind of ontology that is separate from physical things. But to me, I don't see, even if I grant there is this other ontology which is completely separate from materialism, there doesn't seem to be any reason to believe it can do anything that materialism can't do. So if we want to posit this thing as the creator of the universe, this new supernatural thing, but it can do nothing more or less than material things, then we're equally justified in saying that material things are the cause of the universe as this new category.
No, so first, I'm not just positing that there's this new thing. I'm saying we have direct experience with it in ourselves every second of every day, and in our interactions with other human beings. So it's not. At first, we're not talking about God. We're talking about ourselves and the difference between, coughing and writing poetry. And there seems to be a pretty significant difference there. And I'm honing in on that difference and noticing that the difference requires that the type of thing that writing poetry is fundamentally different than the type of thing that coughing is. And that the coughing action is the type of action that purely material things are solely capable of. They're not capable of the type of action involved in writing poetry. And that's the distinction I'm making between non-intentional and intentional action. So I'm looking at it in ourselves, and then I'm looking at the physical action in the universe and saying, all right, well, before we were around, because right now there's all kinds of interactions, and it'd be hard to even find a non-intentional action on planet Earth that didn't have some sort of intentional action from a human being tied to it somewhere in its distant past, right? So let's posit before humans were even around. Was it all just non-intentional action? And what I'm saying is it couldn't have been, because non-intentional action by its nature requires prior action. So the unique power that I'm ascribing to intentional action is the ability to begin action apart from the necessity of prior action.
Right, and my argument is that seems we can just say the same thing about intentional action, that it requires prior action. Like, why do we assume it doesn't require prior action? And why do we? Why would it?
Because the types of causation that are necessary for intentional action are not, they don't rely on prior states of affairs. That they are non-spatial and non-physical.
Okay, so you're saying that because it's outside of space-time, then it's no longer contingent on the prior action criterion that you've outlined. Is that it?
Yes, or at least it's not contingent on space-time action, which is what we're referring to with non-intentional actions.
Okay, so if we could discover a physical particle that could exist outside of space-time, could that have this same property?
I don't think that that's conceptually possible.
Hypothetically, if it was hypothetically possible that we discovered a particle or natural property or something of the universe that existed outside of space-time, would you say that could also have this property to create the universe?
If it had the power to act of its own accord, rather than the power to, or rather than being limited to acting only when acted upon.
So right,
those are the only options.
So if it's independent of space-time, because that's what you said, the reason that intentionality could create the universe and particles can't create the universe, the reason that it's not contingent on prior things is because it's outside of space-time, right?
The reason that a being with intentionality doesn't depend on prior action for intentional action is because the causal goings on aren't dependent on space-time causation.
Okay, so if the causal going-ons are not dependent on space-time causation for the particle, we discover a particle that the causal going-ons for this particle are not dependent on space-time, could it plausibly create the universe as like a competing hypothesis to the intentionality thing?
I'm not sure what it would mean. I would just say that it's intentional. It's intentional action.
Okay, so if like, suppose there were physicists who discovered theories of particles of things that existed outside of space-time, non-intentional, still again, just nature in motion, essentially, no intentionality behind it. But they existed outside of space-time, so they were equally outside of the causal determination of space-time as your intentionality. Would that be a reasonable counter-argument to your position?
No, I don't think that that's even possible. So
I grant it for the sake of argument. Say hypothetically if it was possible.
Well, I mean, you can't grant a logical impossibility, and that's what I think that is.
Okay, that's fair enough. So it's actually been done. We have physical theories of exactly that, emergent spacetime from Sean Carroll and Nima Arkani-Hamad's amplituhedron. So we actually do have physical theories of exactly that, which is why I brought it up. And it seems to me that using theories in physics, which are only combinations of known physics, so everything in physics is just combining known principles, particles, and laws in physics that have already been demonstrated to exist, and they combine them in different ways to create new theories. That is more reasonable to me than believing in adding in new properties that we haven't demonstrated exist, like free will to the supernatural. Like I don't think you mentioned that we experience them every day, but that seems to not work as a compelling argument to anybody who's in psychology, neurology, physics, any kind of scientific field. It seems like that argument is essentially just presupposing free will. We experience it, we're going to label it free will, but it doesn't actually count as evidence for any such free will, which is why the vast majority of philosophers and scientists reject the idea completely. It's not because it's not a coherent definition. It's just saying we experience this thing and we're going to label it free will. You haven't actually given us a definition of what it is at all. So it seems to me that it's more reasonable to go with the physicists who are only using properties of things we have demonstrated exist in reality with testable predictions and are not just imaginary, rather than to go with this new ontology of supernatural things. Would you disagree with that?
Yes, although I mean, not in the way that you said it. I would characterize it differently. Obviously, my characterization of it would be, first of all, and I think this is what it's going to boil down to, because of your rejection of the reality of genuine mental states that aren't causally reducible. I mean, like I said, it turns out so that it ends up basically undermining the rest of the argument. My reason for believing in free will isn't so much that we introspectively see it. I think that there are good arguments based on that, but I can see why it seems shaky. I think the better argument is a sort of axiomatic argument that if there's no fundamental difference between what's going on in my mind and what's going on in my stomach, then I've got no reason to believe even that idea is true. So it's self-defeating. It would
What do you
be
mean?
like,
Because from my understanding, like the fact that they both are physical processes doesn't mean there isn't a difference. So the fact, like we can have physical processes that create oceans and physical processes that create stars, but they're clearly different things. So,
but can we have physical processes that accurately correspond to the facts of reality
sure, why
in
not?
a conceptual way?
Sure, why not? Why wouldn't we be able to?
Because of the nature of concepts. Concepts are fundamentally mental entities. They can't be reducible to physical phenomenon.
I don't think anyone in neurology or psychology agrees with that, because from my understanding, concepts are just neurological processes. They do just different kinds of brain chemistry. But the question is can those different kinds of brain chemistry correspond to reality? And the answer should be yes. I don't see why they couldn't. Like I can imagine a universe with a unicorn in it, and that unicorn may or may not correspond to reality. And so it seems possible that even if it is purely brain chemistry, that those things could correspond to reality, like by random chance, even alone, just by saying we just imagine a whole bunch of different worlds. One of them is going to be reality. So one of the ideas in our head is going to correspond to reality. Why wouldn't our brain chemistry be able to correspond to reality?
So you're equivocating between brain chemistry and what you're positing is caused by the brain chemistry there. So your idea is that the brain chemistry causes you to think of a unicorn, but the thinking of the unicorn is the conceptual act that I'm talking about,
Right.
and not the brain chemistry itself, right? So, or would you say that you thinking of the unicorn just is the brain chemistry?
Yeah, it literally is the brain chemistry, like saying that the screen on my TV that I'm looking at is the electrical signals being sent to the diodes in the screen, causing the red, blue, green things to light up. That's what it is. And I'd say I'd say the same thing about consciousness.
The idea in your head, not that it's caused by the brain chemistry, but you're saying that it is the brain chemistry. So the chemicals form the shape of a unicorn in your head.
Sort of. There's different neurons that correspond to shape and size in your brain, and those neurons light up in order to create the image of a unicorn in your visual cortex. It's not like it's literally the shape of a unicorn in your brain. There are neurons in your brain that correspond to shape, and if those neurons light up, then you will get the shape of a unicorn. So yes.
And you think that can correspond to external realities, not just randomly, like if a unicorn happens to be flying around Mars right now, then the neurons happen to get it right. But in an ongoing intentional way where you're guiding it.
Yeah, so just the first thing I would say is just starting with the randomness. It's possible that our brain chemistry could randomly correspond to reality. And if that's enough for me to say that yes, it is possible for brain chemistry to correspond to reality in some way. And if and from what you said, I thought you were denying that. I thought you said it was impossible for brain chemistry, even randomly, to correspond to reality. Would you accept that it is possible randomly?
No, I don't think it is. I was just going another step further in trying to understand what you believe.
So if you can imagine something, anything, if brain chemistry can make any kind of imagination at all, there's some small percent chance that imagination does correspond to reality, right? Or would you say that it's completely zero? It's logically impossible for any image to ever correspond to reality if it's through brain chemistry?
Well, I think it's impossible for any mental phenomenon to be completely reducible to physical phenomena.
Um, okay. I mean, that seems to be begging the question. Again, most experts in the field seem to reject that, so I can't really
Well,
grant that.
when you say the field, you're talking about psychology, but have you studied much in philosophy of mind?
Yeah, I've studied in pretty much every scientific field that's relevant: psychology, neurology, philosophy of mind, ethics, morality, every kind of field, and they all consensus in every single one of them is the vast majority are physicalists. In philosophy, especially, I think. Pretty much the thing that most philosophers agree on is that physicalism over idealism is a very small subset. Idealism and dualism are very small subsets. They're like under 10% each. To
Yeah,
quote, it's the Phil Survey's paper, which is the largest poll of philosophers done in those fields that can show that's the under 10%.
yes. I agree with those relative statistics. I don't know the numbers myself, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if that was the case. So I'm not disagreeing with that. But I would recommend the work of Jaegwon Kim on this subject. He is a physicalist, and he was basically trying to say, hey, look, we have to kind of be honest here. We can't have genuine mental states and genuine mental properties on physicalism. One has to go. And
Well,
he
by
stuck with
genuine, do you mean like its own kind of thing? Because if it's you're saying by genuine, you mean its own kind of thing. I mean, yeah, I totally agree. I think it's an emergent property. So I don't think that mental states are their own thing. I think they're just like stars. Stars aren't their own thing either. But I don't think we have to get rid of them. They're just an emergent property of atoms coming
so
together.
so what he means is that they can't be onto or but by genuine, it would mean that it's not ontologically and causally reducible to the physical.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. So if you say that mental states are ontologically separate from physical states and they are not reducible to physical states, then yeah, you're right. You couldn't say that if you think they're reducible to physical states.
Well, and the implication is that you can't have things like reason, free will, and things like that. And granted, you don't have much of a problem with rejecting free will, but most philosophers, and this isn't just philosophers of mind, most philosophers in general would say that reason does necessitate the possibility of free will, or not just possibility, the actuality of free will. And so they would say that they would opt for the sort of indeterminist random route of saying, well, free will is either a mystery, we just don't understand it, we'll figure it out someday, or it's something like the randomness of quantum physics. That there's something like that going on, and that's the best explanation we can give of it. But they still want to hold on to free will because they recognize that free will is necessary for genuine rationality and cognition.
I'm not sure what you mean there, because again, the Phil Survey's paper I mentioned, they all reject free will predominantly. It's the vast majority of the rejection. They're either compatibilists or determinists in the physical sense, but they all accept rationality. Like if you look at their theories of truth, correspondence theory of truth, coherence theory of truth, they all grant rationality. So I don't see any philosophical requirement or anyone in philosophy who grants that you need free will to have rationality. I mean, I think you can have rationality purely by deterministic causes. Like a computer can be a rational thing. You don't need free will to be rational. I don't think. Why would you need that?
So we're getting into territory that I just haven't brushed up on recently, which, like I said, maybe we can have a separate discussion on that. But the fundamental conviction that I would put forth for that is that rationality requires conceptual thinking, and that conceptual mental states and things like qualia, the quality of phenomenology and mental states uh, are the types of things that just can't be reducible ontologically or causally to molecules bumping into each other.
Why would we need that second thing for rationality? Because again, I think we can have rationality. Just a calculator can be rational. Like, why would we need that second state to be rational? Why do we need that conceptual second category at all? What do you
Well,
mean by rationality?
everything that you're submitting as a example of rationality is something that has been created by humans. So I'm referring to the cognitive mental process that goes into forming a proposition about reality, which, and then that times a million on the complexity scale goes into building something like a calculator or a computer.
Right. So I could just use a different example. I could think that systems of stars and things could be rational because it's essentially like a calculator. It just functions on the laws of physics and corresponds to them in some way, and so it gets the right result mathematically. It doesn't. You don't need a mind or intentionality to get rationality. Rationality can just be a result of physical processes. Like storms can be rational in some sense. Why? What do
Okay,
you mean
so
by rationality?
so I would disagree with that because the right answer begs the question, according to what or to whom. Um, so by rationality here I mean the ability to uh, form ideas or propositions or concepts that accurately correspond to reality, and then to engage in those concepts in an intentional manner so that you can live as a human being, do everything that we do every single day.
Right. So I understand rationality is just the quality of being based in accordance with reason and logic. So that's why computers are perfectly rational. Even if a computer was just made through quantum mechanical processes, like a storm or something, which is a kind of computer in a way, or which I think DNA is a kind of computer made by purely random processes. I see no reason we can't call those rational, even without the supernatural conscious idea thing.
Well, and what I mean by rationality here specifically is for humans, and the aspect of conceptuality, of conceiving of ideas and propositions and things like that. So because I'm not trying to use computers or calculators to prove that this property exists in the world. I'm using myself and yourself and human beings in general to prove that there is something that is non-ontologically and causally reducible to the physical world, and that is our minds.
So would you also apply
And-
that to animals? Would animals be rational by that definition?
Possibly. I haven't put much thought into it. I think it's possible that animals might be rational to certain extents, and it might vary uh, between species. I'm not sure.
Okay, because the way I see it, I think I define rationality as the ability to make your ideas correspond to reality, essentially. And I think that can perfectly well be done purely by biochemistry. I don't see any reason, like maybe if what you're referring to by rationality is something different than what I'm referring to, and like we can call them rationality A and rationality B. Like rationality A is just purely biochemical, the ability to get your mental processes, your biochemical ideas to correspond to reality. Do your ideas match reality? And yours, rationality B, is trying to get your ideas, which are non-physical, to match reality or something like that. But it seems like if we can get our ideas to match reality, it doesn't seem to make a difference if they're physical or non-physical. As long as they can match reality, that's good enough. Why would we need this extra property if it's possible for just our physical processes to match reality? Couldn't we call that rationality? Why would we need this other thing to call it rationality at all?
So the rationality B that I'm proposing involves things like uh, the the vision of the computer in front of myself right now, right? The quality of that image that I am seeing isn't the type of thing that can be composed of, that the experience isn't the type of thing that can be composed of molecules in my brain.
Why not? Because again, that seems to be the consensus in most fields. Like we know in neurology, like the what I'm seeing literally is a composition of neurons in my brain. Like the shapes and things are done by specific neurons, and if you damage those neurons, then the things you're seeing lose shape in your mind. You can't focus on shape.
So you're referring to the neurons that cause that perception, but not the image itself, right? So when I'm looking at this computer screen, there is not a replica of the screen and the feeling of the edges and your face and my face, etc., physically inside my brain.
Right.
There's something non-physical that we call an idea, and that's the thing that corresponds to reality. And it might have causal interplay with the things in my brain, and in fact I agree with you that it does, but it's not ontologically reducible to the stuff that's going on in my brain.
I'm not sure what you mean there. So, because if I like turn my TV screen off, the image of the TV screen isn't being reproduced anywhere in the computer, but we know it's still there. Like I can just turn the TV screen on and it'll come back. So it seems like I can make the same argument about the image on my TV screen and my computer, is that there is no image on my TV screen being reproduced in the computer. Like there's no LEDs or diodes anywhere in the computer. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros that tell the TV screen what to produce. It seems like neurology and biochemistry could do the same thing, is that it tells a certain part of our brain what to produce when we create an image, and which is what the image is just a set of biochemistry. I don't see why that wouldn't be reducible to physical processes.
So if I sort of mentally take a snapshot of the computer screen here and I close my eyes and I draw from memory the same image and it's roughly similar, are you saying that you think that in my brain the neurons are actually physically reproducing this exact image?
Yeah, like we can actually demonstrate that. Like we can go in and take certain neurons.
Like if you had the right type of technology, you could go into my brain and see the exact same image.
You would read the brain and then reproduce the image the brain was
searching. But that's different. So
I don't like, how would that be different in a computer? Like if we look at just the computer, we couldn't go into the computer and see the TV screen. It's just a bunch of ones and zeros and electrical signals, but we know it's still producing the TV screen signal.
Yeah, but so I'm not talking about what causes it here. I'm just talking about the ontology, the thing itself, the image itself just is different from all the little nodes, whether you're talking about the TV screen or you're talking about your mental screen. The image itself, the quality of the image itself, the shades of color, the dimensions, all of those things, the shadows, none of those things are ontologically reducible to neurons. They just are qualitatively completely different. They're completely other.
I'm not sure I follow. So like if I take a CD and I put a CD into a computer and it plays music, like the music isn't ontologically reducible to the CD. Like you can't find the sound waves hidden in the CD anywhere. But we know that the CD creates the correct signal to produce the sound.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that the same thing applies to consciousness, is that sound is a function of the brain. It is the collection of the neurons acting together as a systematic process, which is the image. The image is that systematic process. Like literally, that's what it causes it.
Yeah. But notice you're saying that in the CD analogy, the CD is analogous to our brain neurons, and maybe the CD and the CD player and the speakers combined. The whole apparatus combined is analogous. And then the sounds coming out of the speaker are analogous to the mental states that we're talking about. But even there, notice that the sound is ontologically different than the CD and the CD player and everything else that's going on. You might say that it's causally reducible, and I think that's what you want to say. You want to say it's causally reducible to the sound itself is causally reducible to all those things, which I don't think it is. But it it's still ontologically not the same thing. It's not ontologically reducible. The quality of the sound, the sound of it, A minor. I don't know music very well, so I have no idea what that would be. But somebody who knows music would be able to identify it and say that's not the same thing as a G sharp or whatever the case is, right? Those different qualities are not ontologically the same thing as the causes of them in the CD player.
Well, that's why I used the example of the computer screen, because in that case they are. Because my argument is they are the same. They are literally the same. I don't see why they wouldn't be reducible. It's just a transition between two different reading languages, essentially. There's a part of your brain that is the brain chemistry, and it is read by a different part of your brain which produces the image. But the image is literally just some chemical process in your brain. They're not ontologically separate any more than the TV is ontologically separate from the computer.
But the ontologically separate thing that I'm talking about is the image itself. So unless you want to say that the chemicals are forming the image in your brain such that someone with the right tool could go inside and literally see directly the same image, not reprogram it, reconstruct it, but literally see the exact same thing, unless that's the case, then there is an ontological difference between the image itself and the neural causes of the image, whatever they may be.
I don't see that. So for example, take the computer screen example again. If I turn off the screen, the computer works just fine. It knows everything that's on the screen. It can interact with the things on the screen. It can memorize where they are. It can do everything it wants with them, with the screen being off. Like you don't need a screen at all. And if I look in the computer, I'm never going to see the screen anywhere in the computer, but everything on the screen is still being generated exactly as it is. And the computer knows it. The computer is fully aware of everything on the screen without any actual screen. The same thing applies to the mind. Like we're aware of the mind because we are the mind, just like the computer is aware of everything on the screen without a screen. The screen is just an analogy in that sense. Everything inside the computer is purely inside the computer, and it generates the screen, and it's aware of the screen without there actually being an image.
But that's one of the key differences, though, is the computer can't see the image the way that we can.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We don't actually, the image we see is just a composite of neurological signals that create a illusion of an image. It's not an actual image. It's not, the image doesn't exist in some kind of ontology. It's just an illusion created by brain chemistry.
Okay, but whatever the illusion is, the quality of experiencing that illusion is something that a computer can't experience.
Well, I think that'll be demonstrated false when we get AI. I don't see why it wouldn't be able to.
Okay, so well, if it was able to, then it wouldn't be much different than what you're claiming right now about the brain and brain chemistry. We're still talking about something qualitatively different, which means that it has to be ontologically different.
Well, that's the good way to phrase it. I don't think any kind of qualitative difference demands an ontological difference. That is not the case. It's like two sides of the same coin. You don't need an ontological difference to demonstrate there is a qualitative difference between some particular thing. Like we know that there's suns have different effects on, if you're a massive body like the Earth, well, then you're going to be affected by the gravity of the sun. But if you're an electron, then you're not going to be affected by the gravity of the sun at all. So there's different qualitative effects that the sun has dependent upon what you are, an Earth or an electron, even though there's no ontological difference in the sun and how it affects the electron of the Earth. It's the same thing either way. So for me, I'm saying that brain chemistry is ontologically the same thing, even though there's qualitative difference between the scope of what we're talking about, whether it's a perception of an image or the biochemistry, which is the same thing, it's just from a different perspective.
All right, well, I think we're probably going to have to end it there.
Fair enough, yeah. Yeah, we've been going for about an hour. I think that was the scheduled time. So yeah, it was an interesting conversation. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And like I said, maybe I'll brush up on my philosophy of mind stuff, and we can have another conversation as a follow-up later.
Yeah, for sure. And send me your paper and the one by the guy's name who I definitely will not be able to pronounce.
Jaegwon Kim.
Yeah. Thanks.
I'll send it.
Talk to you later.